Hello networking students. I'm here today to talk about a lab assignment that is entitled Basic Switch and End Device Configuration. And although I'm not going to go through the assignment all the way to its completion, I think it's important that we talk about some of the initial configurations and settings that are required to complete this lab. It's in what's called Packet Tracer physical mode. So this is as distinguished from the logical mode, which most of us are more familiar with the topology diagram. Physical mode is a pretty good attempt to create an environment which looks like the real world. So you can see in the upper left a depiction of what might be the logical mode view or the topology, and this basic switch and end device configuration lab consists of 2 PCs and 2 switches, and then we have some connecting cables, so Ethernet cables. You'll recall from other networking classes that when we cable together 2 switches or 2 like devices, we use something called a crossover cable. And when we are connecting dissimilar devices, I call it like a dumb device. So a switch doesn't have a lot of intelligence built into it. And something that is an intelligent device, like a computer, then we use what's called an Ethernet straight through cable. So those things will come in handy to us while we are setting up the physical view configuration. Let's take a look at the objectives of the lab so we can sort of pull this area up so that we get a little bit more view. And we see that in this physical mode activity, you're going to build a very simple network that has the 2 hosts and the 2 switches, and then you're going to set up some of the very basic configurations like host name, local passwords, and the login banner, things that you studied in the Cisco Networking Academy reading for the last week or so. So let us get down to it. We want to set up the topology, and over on the right hand side here we see the environment that we have to work in. We see a table over here on the lower right, and we see a rack, and then our various equipment at our disposal, our cables on the cable pegboard, and then we see equipment on the shelf. There's going to be some equipment that we don't need to use in this particular assignment, so we'll just leave it on the shelf. Let's start with the PCs. And you can see that I'm working on a laptop screen which has a little bit of challenges, let's call them, with screen geography. So I'm going to be scrolling left and right. But this is also a good tutorial for you in case you also have some of these same challenges. So I am first going to take PC A, left click my mouse, and drag it over to the left side of the table. I can then scroll over and see PCA on the table. I then need to take PCB, which I will left click my mouse and drag. You see that the background of the screen turns yellow, indicating that that will be the active area when I let go of the mouse. So now we have two PCs on the table. Our topology shows two switches, S1 and S2. Those switches can be retrieved from the shelf that we see here. And I see S1 on the third shelf from the top, and I see S2 on the top shelf toward the right. So let's start with switch 1. You see that I'm going to slide over ever so gingerly until I see just a little bit of that switch and just a little bit of the rack. So I'm going to click and drag until the switch is a little bit onto the rack, and when I let go, it pops into place. If I slide over, I can see now that the switch is in place on the rack. Now switch 2 is going to be a little trickier. First, what I'm going to do is drag switch 2 from its top shelf right down to this empty space on the left, and then I will continue by using the same technique used for switch 1 to drag it over to the rack. Alright, now I have switch 1 and switch 2 on the rack and PC1 and PC2 on the table. Now's the time to do some cabling. So as I mentioned previously, PCA, a smart device, will connect to switch 1 with a straight through cable. So let's hover over and see what we have here. We have a console cable, we have copper straight through cables, we have a USB cable, we have crossover cables, phone cables, serial DCE for serial connections, and another USB cable. Alright, so we are going to need a straight through cable to connect the PCA to switch 1's F06 port. It's a little bit small on the screen here, a little bit of challenge to see, so what I am going to do is use the tool here up on our menu bar, the plus sign, to zoom in a bit, and I can take and click this copper straight through cable, and then I will see that there's a tiny little cable end icon that appears. I can go over to switch 1 and hover over all the various connections until I find Fast Ethernet 0/6, and I can click. That will enable the connection into that port. Now, where does that cable need to go? It needs to go into a fast Ethernet port on the PC. In this particular PC's front view, we really only have the one port, so I will click, and now that cable is connected. That was pretty straightforward. Let us move on and perform a similar technique for PC 2 and switch 2. So I'm going to click the cable, and on switch 2 I need to go to the fast Ethernet 18 as shown in the topology diagram. Left click my mouse, come down so that I can see PC 2, and click the fast Ethernet, and we have another connection. By using the spyglass here with the R in it, that will zoom back or snap back to our original size and view, and we can see our cables between the PCs and the switches connected. Now we need to connect the two switches to one another, and that is done fast Ethernet 0/1 to fast Ethernet 0/1 between the two switches. And remember, when we are connecting like devices, we are going to use the crossover cable. So let us click the crossover cable, and we can go fast Ethernet 0/1, left click, and fast Ethernet 0/1, left click, to connect those two devices together. Again, if you want to see a little better view, we can zoom in one click. Now, that makes the physical connections between the physical devices look like what we have over in the topology diagram. But recall that we need a way to manage these devices, these switches. So to manage them, we need some kind of management device. Well, these PCs can do double duty for us. They can be devices that are part of the network, but they can also be management devices. So to manage the switch, we need something called the console cable. Okay, so the console cable will be connected between this port here on the PC. Well, let's click the PC, and we can see now that there is a console port. We also need to turn on the PC, so we can do that with the power button. You can see the power light turned on. All right. Now, that console port will need to connect to the switch to its console port. But where is that port? Don't see it here. If I click to get a better view, we can see that the console port happens to be on the rear side of the device. So our challenge becomes, how do we see the rear side of that device? Well, it turns out if I right-click my mouse, I can choose Inspect Rear, and now I will see the console port on the switch. So I'm going to click the console cable, and I will again see that tiny little icon that shows a cable end. I'm going to click the console connection and then slide down to my PC and connect to the RS-232 port for a serial console connection on PC1. And I will want to do a very similar thing for the second switch. I'm going to right-click that, inspect the rear, take my second console cable, click, and position it over the console port, left-click again, slide down and over till I see PCB, PC2, and click its RS-232, and voila. Now I have all the connections I should need to move on with the lab. The end devices are connected to the switches, the two switches are connected to each other, and we have console connections between the PCs and each switch. If I click PCA, I can find out that I am able to click the desktop tab, and I have at my disposal various services that are available for that PC. Further in the lab, you're going to have to do some IP configuration. That's available. You have a terminal, and it just so happens that the terminal settings are correct. If I click OK, I can see that via that RS-232 console connection, I am now connected to the switch and will be able to configure that switch. So we have everything that you will need to move forward and be successful completing the lab 2.9.2 basic switch and device configuration. So very good luck, and I know that you will learn a lot when you complete this lab.